Alright guys, we're back in my garage for another video. If you're new to the channel, I use these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. So today we're going to be talking about the difference between the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 B58, primarily from a tuning perspective. And I know a lot of people are starting to look at the two different engines. They're getting a lot more closer in price. Some of the earlier vehicles that came with Gen 1 engines are going up in price because of inflation and just the market's getting more competitive, while some of the later model vehicles with the TU engines are starting to see a little bit of depreciation. So I see more people cross-shopping between the two, or maybe like some of you guys, you can afford a later model vehicle with a TU engine, but you don't want to buy it and be locked down or limited on modifications. So I just want to talk about the differences in this video, so hopefully it can help explain what I would recommend depending on your goals. And if you're trying to make this decision, hopefully it can help you out. So the first thing that we want to be clear about is that there are multiple versions of the B58 as well as the B58TU. So the first generation B58 was in earlier BMWs from 2015 all the way up until 2021 or so, whereas the TU engine was put in vehicles starting in 2019 all the way up to the current date. Now there are two different versions of the TU engine as well. One is a lower compression engine with a 6-port cylinder head that makes a little more power, and then there's also a higher compression version with a 2-port cylinder head that makes a lower amount of power. All of this is tuning from BMW, and there are some other technical differences as well, but we're mostly going to talk about just the difference between them from a tuning aspect. Now, the two big things that I look at between these two engines are the strength of the engine, basically how much power it can hold without opening up the engine, and also the fueling, because this is very different between the two, both from a stock perspective and an aftermarket perspective. So again, just depending on your goals, this can kind of help guide you to the platform that will help you get there quicker. So from a strength standpoint, the main thing that I look at is that the TU engines with a lower compression engine seem to be able to hold more power without opening up the block. And this makes a lot of sense because with lower compression, it should be able to handle more boost and be able to make more power without putting too much stress on the combustion chamber. Now, keep in mind, a lower compression engine also tends to be a little bit slower to spool, and it also tends to need a little bit more boost to make the same amount of power. But in our case, the difference seems to be pretty negligible between, Gen 2 engines with a high compression and low compression engine, especially in models like Supras, where both of them were offered in the exact same chassis. We see a lot of similarities between them and how they perform, but especially for higher horsepower levels where you'll really be pushing the limits of the block, the 6-port version does seem to be able to flow more air so it can make more power and hold more power without actually opening up the engine. So that's kind of like the best of both worlds, having the 6-port head just like a Gen 1 with the lower compression from a Gen 2 to be able to make as much power as possible. Now keep in mind, it's still not bulletproof. A lot of people are seeing many Supras and M340i's making 800 plus wheel horsepower on the stock engine. And while this can work, there's not always a promise that this will work for a long time. And so just keep that in mind. Every time you see somebody hitting some crazy numbers, 800 or 850 wheel horsepower, that's good to see. But if you're planning on going that far, make sure you have money available and placed to the side just in case something breaks, because most likely something will. Now, the other aspect that has a really big difference is fueling. With the B58, the highest horsepower version came with around 360 horsepower, whereas with the B58TU, it came with over 380 horsepower. And because of a combination of everything that BMW did to support that, they also incorporated a higher flowing high pressure fuel pump. So the B58TU engine can make more power on a completely stock fuel system than a Gen 1 B58. Usually on a Gen 1, you're limited to around 450 horsepower or so on an ethanol mix, whereas with the B58TU, you can make between 500 and 550 with the stock TU pump. So for most people that just want to stay stock turbo and have a good amount of power, I usually recommend a vehicle with a TU engine, because with just a downpipe and an ethanol tune or a flex fuel kit, you can make 500 to 550 horsepower reliably with a mostly stock looking engine bay. Now, on the other hand, if you're shooting for more than that, I typically recommend a Gen 1. And the reason why is because the Gen 1 actually has high pressure fuel pump upgrades available that make it a lot easier to hit your goal. So you're able to basically do a turbo, fuel pump, and a downpipe and make 600 to 650 wheel horsepower pretty reliably, again with an ethanol mix. This can all be controlled like factory. It's controlled by the DME without any auxiliary fueling or different systems and controllers. All you need is a good tune with the correct hardware, and you can easily hit in the 600s. Now 700 is about the limit there, so this is something again where you kind of got to decide, do you want to push past that point? This is typically when you start running into issues like transmission slipping, drive shaft snapping, and you just start really getting outside of just simple engine modifications that make power on an otherwise stock vehicle. But if you are looking to push that way, then it's really kind of a wash between the two. By that point, you're going to need port injection regardless. You're probably going to need to upgrade your transmission and a lot of other things. Like I said, auxiliary systems are going to be hitting their limits. So you just kind of got to be ready for things to break at that standpoint. Also in a Gen 1 and high compression Gen 2s, this is when people typically start building their engines when they're pushing 700 to 750. You're really close to the limit and kind of on borrowed time. So again, just to put everything together, if you're trying to stick with the stock turbo and stay in the low 500s, definitely hop on a TU engine vehicle. If you're looking to get up to 600 to 650, then usually a Gen 1 is a little bit easier to get there just because you can simply upgrade your fuel pump and turbo and bolt everything else on like stock, and the DME will control it and make plenty of power. After that, if you're shooting for 700 plus, then you really just kind of got to pick which one you prefer. And if you don't want to build your engine, a low compression TU will give you the best reliability. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about that most people don't seem to think about or address is the chassis. Because when you go from a Gen 1 to a BMW with a Gen 2, you're going to be adding a significant amount of weight. And most of the Gen 2s are going to be at least 100 pounds heavier than a comparable Gen 1 F-Series vehicle. And if you're targeting something like 10-second quarter mile or a specific 60 to 130 time, that weight can definitely play a factor. So sometimes I just ask people, what are your goals? Are you looking for a certain amount of power, quarter mile time, track duty, reliability, just for driving to work every day, whatever the case may be. Really look at that from an entire standpoint of this is the vehicle that I'm going to use, not just to make a certain amount of power, but also to perform a certain way. If you're just looking for something that's comfortable, that can get you around town, the later model TU engines win every single time. I think the new interiors look really great. Whereas if you want something that's lighter and a little more tossable, something like an F22 M240 is going to be really hard to beat and still be able to support a lot of power. So don't just focus on the engine, also think about the platform and the chassis that it's going in, and if that meets your needs, because that's going to be a really big factor in the actual performance and drivability. Now, on top of that, consider that the Supra is in its own league. It's the lightest out of all of them. It's the fastest out of all of them, the most aerodynamic. Pretty much everything about it is the best from a performance standpoint, except it doesn't have 2 rear seats. It's a lot smaller. So if you do need back seats or just a bigger vehicle in general due to your lifestyle or being able to drive your family around, then that might just knock it off of the list on its own. So yeah, I think that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.